and thank you all for sharing a part of your day with us. I am very excited and happy to have Dr. Cerf as a guest speaker today for my class, ICT 4800, which is Network Communications and the Internet. We are very excited, as well as other students from the Information and Communications Technology Department at the University of Denver. So the way that this will work is that we'll do a small intro. Dr. Cerf will do a lecture and then followed by a short Q&A. Dr. Cerf, he is the co-designer and of the TCP/IP protocol and the architect of the internet. Dr. Cerf is currently the vice president and chief internet evangelist for Google. The internet is something that we use every day for business, education, government, and essentially everything in our modern way of life. And today, Dr. Cerf will speak on the interplanetary internets, the Internet of Things, as well as their opportunities and challenges. So today, we are very lucky to have a pioneer share his thoughts on the internet today and in the future. So please welcome Dr. Cerf. Dr. Cerf, I hope you're able to take it over from here.
Well, let's first of all, am I audible? That's the test number one. And the second one, thanks, Dave. The other thing is that when I go to share screen, I have to be careful to make sure that it doesn't cut my microphone off, which is a classic problem with some of these applications, because they think that there's audio in the shared screen, so they kill the mic. So I'm going to go back to share screen here and see whether I can get the right tab up, and I'll turn off the share tab audio. You know, they ought to make that little thing much bigger and more obvious. I can't tell you how many times I've screwed up by not having unchecked that. So first question is whether you can see this, and is it full screen for you?
Yeah.
Yes, sir, it is.
Yes, it's great.
That's great. Okay, so I've used these slides before, just that's why it says August. So I hope you'll forgive me for that. I'm being lazy today. I'm going to take you back into history for a while, and then we're going to go look at the future. So way back in 1969, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency decided that it was going to build a packet switch network, which was heresy at the time because everybody knew the way you did communications was circuit switching. And but that didn't work very well for computers that are flinging out data going in various directions, more like electronic postcards. So they decided to build a packet switch network. And by happenstance, I was at UCLA as a graduate student that year, and was drawn into the implementation of this packet switched ARPANET, and was responsible at UCLA for building software to measure the performance of the network and to compare that with the queuing theoretic models that one of my thesis advisors, Professor Leonard Kleinrock, was promoting as a way of predicting what network performance would look like. And so we were doing measurements and comparing with the queuing theoretic models to see whether they were predicting the actual performance that we experienced. And this project was extremely successful. It grew very rapidly over time. We had different kinds of computers interacting with each other. That was a challenge all by itself because there were different brands of machines that were not designed to communicate with each other. They had different word lengths, they had different operating systems, they even had different character encoding sets. So making them compatible with each other required a significant amount of protocol design and commonality, adoption of common standards. So it was very successful. It grew very, very quickly. And among the various applications that came up were remote access to time-shared machines, file transfer, and electronic mail, which gets invented around 1971. And the consequence of the success of this thing led to another very important effort, and that was to this was motivated by getting people at different campuses, a dozen different universities, to share their resources and their progress in computer science and artificial intelligence way back in the early 1970s. After the success of this program was demonstrated, the Defense Department decided that maybe it should look at the possibility of using computers in command and control. And that immediately implied that you would need computers in mobile vehicles, you'd need them in aircraft, and you'd need them in ships at sea. The network you're looking at was built out of dedicated circuits connecting the blue packet switches to each other. But if you used wires to connect the ships at sea, they get all tangled up, and the tanks would run over the wires, and the airplanes would never make it off the tarmac. So by the time my colleague Robert Kahn showed up at Stanford University, where I went after I finished my PhD to join the faculty, he said, we have a problem because now we have to figure out how to connect a mobile packet radio network, a packet satellite network for long distance communication, and the original ARPANET. They were all very different networks with different data rates, different error rates, different latencies, and different addressing structures. And yet we needed to make them all look uniform so that a computer on any of the networks of the internet would be able to interoperate with any of the others. So that was the internet problem. If we go to the next slide, you'll see that that by 1977, we had evolved the TCP/IP protocols sufficiently that we could demonstrate their use in a very, I would say, ambitious environment. We had the mobile packet radio network was in operation in San Francisco. The packet satellite network was operating over the Atlantic using Eutelsat 4A as the satellite system, with multiple ground stations competing for access to the satellite channel. The ARPANET itself, by that time, had been extended all the way to Europe using an internal satellite hop linking the US-based part of the ARPANET to Norway, and then by landline down to England, to London. So the ARPANET looked like this giant amoeba swallowing the packet radio or packet satellite network. So, and also, I guess, just for the record, in 1976, I left Stanford, the faculty, and joined ARPA to run this program. So I was responsible for packet radio, packet satellite, packet security, as well as the internet program in general. And as the program manager, I wanted to do this demonstration to show that TCP/IP would actually work in a live environment. So we had engineers driving the packet radio van, which you can see over on the left of the slide, up and down the Bayshore Freeway, radiating packets going through a gateway. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but the gateway is between the packet radio net and the ARPANET. It was the routing was set up so that the packets would flow all the way across an internal satellite hop to Norway, and then down to London, to University College London, and then out of the ARPANET at that point through another gateway into the packet satellite network, and then through that network back to the United States through another gateway to Etam, West Virginia, and then back into the ARPANET, and then down to Los Angeles to USC Information Sciences Institute. So between the packet radio van in San Francisco and the ISIC computer was only a 400-mile distance. But the packets actually traveled 100,000 miles because they were going through two synchronous satellite hops across the Atlantic and across the United States twice, and it worked. And I remember jumping around in my office in Washington thinking, it worked, as if it couldn't possibly have worked. All of you, I'm sure, know that if software works, it's a miracle. So this was a very important milestone demonstrated in 1977. After which we concentrated on getting the protocols implemented on every operating system we could get our hands on. And as of the beginning of 1982, we announced that all computers on all the ARPA-sponsored networks would shift over to the TCP/IP protocol so that the full internet operation could be initiated. And so as of January 1, 1983, the operational internet began running, and it has been running ever since. So since that time, a lot has happened. And in the mid-1980s, other agencies of the US government besides ARPA decided they also wanted to have this kind of internet capability available. The National Science Foundation wanted to connect all of the 3,000 research universities around the United States together to each other, and also to the supercomputer resources that NSF was funding. And so they built something like 14 different networks, a core backbone network called NSFNet, and a whole bunch of intermediate regional networks to connect subsets of all the universities together. Then the Department of Energy decided it wanted all of its labs interconnected, so they built the Energy Sciences Network. And NASA decided to connect all of its labs together, and they built the NASA Science Internet. All of those backbone networks were interconnected with the ARPANET. So we had 4 backbone systems running concurrently in the mid 1980s, and that too was extremely successful. And in fact, commercialization started in 1989. The World Wide Web shows up in 1991. The commercialization of the World Wide Web starts in 1994 at Netscape Communications, which releases its Netscape Navigator in 1995. Then it goes public, and the stock goes through the roof, and the dot boom is on. Venture capital, especially in the Silicon Valley, is throwing money at anything that looks like it has something to do with the internet. And this goes crazy for several years until April of 2000, when a whole lot of those startup companies ran out of capital, not understanding that capital is finite and revenue is what keeps the company going. So there was a dot bust in April, but the internet kept growing anyway. And of course, the World Wide Web shows up and becomes essentially the primary application on which almost everything takes place today on the internet. So this is what the internet looks like today, although I'm cheating because this chart was actually drawn automatically in something like 1999, but it illustrates the point I want to make, which is there are tens of thousands of networks that are interconnected on the internet. And they all choose their own hardware and software. They decide who they're going to connect with on what terms and conditions. It's entirely distributed, and it works only because they all adopt the same internet protocols. The only place which is centralized in this entire operation is the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, which is responsible for allocating IP address spaces uniquely to different parties, and also to assure that domain names are allocated on a unique basis. And even that is a very distributed operation because there are regional internet registries that hand out IP address space, and there are hundreds, if not more, domain name registrars that allow people to register domain names that are managed by the registries, like the VeriSign running .com, for example, and .net, or the Internet Society running .org. There are several hundred different top-level domains now. Some are country coded like DE and FR for France and US for the United States, or they're generics like .net, .com, and so on. So there are lots and lots of top-level domains, but then the system is highly distributed for the domain name system to work. There are domain name servers in many different internet service provider operations that are delivering access to internet to the general public. So, so this is what the internet looks like today. It's quite, and of course, it's evolved to be a global system. About 65% of the world seems to have direct access to the internet today, and another 35% still to come. On top of which, we've also encountered another interesting problem, which is running out of address space. The original design used IP version 4, which is a 32-bit address space, which allowed for 4.3 billion terminations, which at the time in 1973 sounded like a lot because that was more than there were people on the planet. But by 1992, it was clear that that was not going to be sufficient. The proliferation of networks had continued. And so a new version of the IP protocol was developed called IP version 6, which has 128 bits of address space. That's essentially 3.4 times 10 to the 38th addresses. And that's enough to last until after I'm dead, then it's somebody else's problem. So that's where we are today. About 35 or 40% of the internet is capable of running both V4 and V6. It's taken a very long time to get V6 everywhere, but the Internet of Things is driving very much towards that. Proliferation of mobiles and IoT devices is going to drive everyone towards IPv6 in the long run. Now, I mentioned that not everywhere, the internet isn't available everywhere, and there are a lot of reasons for that. And these are the things that occupy my time as chief internet evangelist at Google. One of my jobs is to try to get more internet out there so everybody has access to it. That's good for Google, but we hope it's good for everybody as well. So in some cases, there just isn't any infrastructure that can support the internet, and it requires investment to be made. And sometimes there are economic barriers to the investment, or maybe there are economic barriers to paying for access to service. If it's too expensive, people may not be able to afford it. So we have to find ways of driving cost out. Sometimes there are policy inhibitors in some parts of the world. The government runs the communication systems, and they may or may not be friendly to implementing internet backbones, or they don't allow for competition, for example, which could drive cost out. So there are policy issues that sometimes prevent people from getting access to internet. And then there's this question of knowing how to use it, or knowing how to build it and operate it. And if you don't have the right educational background, you may not be able to do that. And that's an inhibitor for getting the internet to go where it needs to go. And there are also accessibility barriers. Even when the internet is in place and affordable and reliable and so on, it may be that it doesn't accommodate what people need if they're blind or hearing impaired or motor impaired or have a cognitive deficit. So figuring out how to make it really accessible is another big challenge, something that at Google that we are very concerned about and invest a lot of time and energy to resolve. So just to give you an example of what surprised me anyway, is the increased amount of subsea cable linking the continents together for purposes of delivering broadband internet services. Did not anticipate that the costs would drop significantly for building undersea fiber. And so the number of fibers has been going up dramatically over the past decade or so, and it's continuing to rise. And so there's a lot of connectivity between the continents that allow for internet to be accessible literally around the world. And then there's another thing happening. I'm sure most of you are aware of the low Earth orbiting satellites, which are also becoming part of the internet family, allowing people to get access from literally anywhere on the planet. And that's wonderful from the internet evangelism point of view, because the investments that are being made help solve my problem, which is getting more internet up there and more people capable of getting access to it. Always there are questions about cost and whether it's affordable and whether it's reliable. But so far, Starlink, which is one of the primary example of low Earth orbit satellite services, worked out remarkably well. So that's another area. Of course, there's O3b, which stands for Other 3 Billion, or OneWeb and Cooper, or additional low Earth orbit satellite offerings. Actually, O3b is a medium Earth satellite. It's closer to 8,000 kilometers. So I'm sorry, I just got pinged, and I was trying to figure out why. Now I have to figure out how to get back to my slides. I don't know if the rest of you have ever had this problem, but sometimes you can't find the right tab. Okay, I found it. I mentioned the Internet of Things was going to be part of the talk. And I can tell you 20 years ago, I was making jokes like every light bulb in the world will have its own IP address. Isn't that funny? It's not funny anymore. There are light bulbs that have IP running in them, like the Philips Hue and others that are controllable remotely by your mobile. One guy showed up with an internet-enabled surfboard. I gathered he was bored sitting on the water waiting for the next wave. So he put a laptop in his surfboard and a Wi-Fi service at the Radio Shack, and he was surfing the internet while he's waiting for the next wave. Other people got mobiles. Other people have internet-enabled picture frames. There's even an internet-enabled refrigerator. You kind of wonder what do you do with an internet-enabled refrigerator? One possibility is that it knows what it has inside because they've got little RFID tags. So it's looking for recipes for you. So when you come home, you can see the recipes up on the display to what you can make for dinner that's in the refrigerator. Of course, if it decides you're on a diet, you might see diet recipes coming up, or maybe it just refuses to open. That would be a terrible future. So these sorts of things are coming in the billions, and they will make demands on the internet address space, and they will make demands on the internet capacity in order to make use of all of the resources that are available there. Now, I wish that I could say that we're almost all done and all we have to do is just get more internet out there. But those of you who've been paying attention know that in addition to being concerned about the reliability, safety, and privacy and security and interoperability of Internet of Things and of artificial intelligence and machine learning, which is clearly a very hot topic these days. We're also very concerned about the misinformation and disinformation that floats around in the network, in the social media, and in other sources. And my solution to that is not machine learning and artificial intelligence. It's more like critical thinking in the wetware up here, teaching people to think critically about what they see and hear, not only online, but in every other source, newspapers, magazines, radio, television, your friends, are all potential sources of misinformation or even deliberate disinformation. So you have to learn how to think critically about the information that you encountered. Where did this information come from? Is there corroborating evidence for any claims that are being made? What was the motivation for putting this stuff up? And are you trying to convince me of something I shouldn't be convinced of? So that takes work, and getting people to think critically is important, needs to be trained early, and it's very similar to the scientific method, which is a more general kind of digital literacy, being aware of risk factors that you might encounter online and learning how to counter those risk factors is what I consider part of digital literacy. We also have potential abuses that take place using this infrastructure, and those abuses can happen across international borders. The result is that we need to have international cooperation to deal with law enforcement, to deal with accountability, to deal with identifying people who are engaged in abusive behavior and holding them accountable for that. We're going to need to cooperate across those international boundaries in order to achieve the accountability that we need. We also need to work hard on providing people with capability to protect themselves. So that could be two-factor authentication or end-to-end encryption and other kinds of mechanisms that will allow people to protect themselves online. I have to say, for those of you who have experience writing software, that you know how hard it is to write software that doesn't have any bugs. And so one of our big challenges is figuring out how to avoid bugs in software, or at least identify them even after the software has been deployed, and then have mechanisms for updating the software in a way that's safe and secure, so that you don't have a device downloading malware from somebody because it doesn't know the difference. So strong authentication and digital signatures and things like that are very, very critical to doing safe automated update of software downloads. And you can imagine how important it is to try to drive bugs out of the software. In some cases, a bug could be fatal, like a self-driving car that doesn't perform properly, or maybe a surgical robot that isn't working the way it should. So we should care a great deal about finding and fixing bugs before we actually use software that has high risk factors associated with it. Again, a major challenge to automate as much as possible the process of discovering bugs, which leads me to argue that we as software developers have an ethical responsibility to all of our users to try hard to make sure that the software is bug-free and that we maintain it and support it through the lifetime of that product. So now let me shift gears for a minute. Way back in 1997, a very important event happened on Mars. A Mars lander successfully arrived, called Pathfinder. It had a small little rover called Sojourner. In 97, this successful landing capped a period of 20 years of failure. The previous successful landings were in 1976, Viking 1 and Viking 2. Then nothing worked for 20 years. Finally, this little Sojourner landed and sent back quite a bit of useful data from Mars. So I flew out from my offices in Washington to the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in 1998 to meet with the team that handled communications for the Mars Sojourner mission. And we immediately began asking ourselves in 1998, what should we be working on that we are going to need 25 years later, which should be, roughly speaking, 2023, which is next year. And we concluded that the thing we should be doing is designing and building an interplanetary backbone network. So we began that work in 1998. And in 2004, many of you will remember that, well, actually, even before 2004, the reconnaissance orbiter, Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter and Mars Express were launched successfully to orbit Mars and map the surface of the planet, so that by 2004, we were able to decide where Spirit and Opportunity were supposed to land on Mars in order to explore and report back what they found. And so Spirit and Opportunity landed. They were supposed to send data back to Earth at the blazing speed of 28 kilobits a second to what's called the Deep Space Network, which has big 70-meter dishes at Canberra, Australia, Goldstone, California, and Madrid, Spain. Those radios on the rovers, Spirit and Opportunity, overheated. And so the engineers backed off on the duty cycle. And so now the scientists are very grumpy because they're not getting as much data back as they wanted. One of the engineers at the Jet Propulsion Lab observed that both of the landers had X-band radios that could reach the orbiters that were only a few hundred miles overhead, and they could transmit data over that short distance at 128 kilobits a second. Well, meanwhile, we've been working on protocols for interplanetary networking, and I have to tell you, the TCP was not going to work in interplanetary distances. They're literally astronomical. The distance between Earth and Mars is 35 million miles when we're closest together, and 235 million miles when we're farthest apart. And the problem there is that at the speed of light, the one-way delay for transmitting data is 3.5 to 20 minutes, and of course, double that per round trip. TCP/IP does not work well with a 40-minute round trip time. Flow control doesn't work. The domain name system doesn't work. So we concluded that we needed to invent a new suite of protocols that would operate in this very different parametric space. And there was one other problem. The planets are rotating, and we don't know how to stop that. And so if you're talking to something on the planet, it rotates. You can't talk to it until it comes back around again. Same problem with some of the orbiters. So we had to design and build a set of protocols for variable delay and disruption. We call that DTN protocols, delay and disruption tolerant networking protocols. That suite of protocols has been fully standardized. In the 2004 incident, when the rovers had the radios overheat, we uploaded the prototype interplanetary software to the orbiters and the rovers. So what the configuration did was the rovers would get data, they'd hold onto it until an orbiter came overhead. They transmitted data to the orbiter, which held onto the data literally in the network until it got to the right place in its orbit to transmit data back to the deep space net. Here's the cool thing. With the 300-mile distance or whatever it is between the rovers on the ground and the orbiters, we could transmit data at 128 kilobits a second. And transmitting from the orbiters that are outside of the atmosphere with larger panels, solar panels, and larger antenna arrays, they were able to transmit data back to the deep space net at 128 kilobits a second. So we got 4 times more data back ever since the 2004 mission, and all missions subsequent to that have been using the prototype interplanetary software. Meanwhile, we continued the evolution of the software in its refinement. We've been running the latest protocols for about a decade now on the International Space Station. We've standardized the delay and disruption tolerant protocols. We call them the bundle protocol suite. They've been standardized at the Internet Engineering Task Force, and they've been standardized at the Consultative Committee on Space Data Systems, which is made up of all of the spacefaring nations in the world. So that standardization has now led us to the opportunity to deploy an interplanetary backbone mission by mission. So we're not going to build the whole thing, but every mission that's launched will have on board the interplanetary protocols. They can use those in order to move data back to accomplish their scientific missions. And when they've completed that, they're able to be reprogrammed to become relays in an interplanetary backbone network. So over the next decades or so, you'll be watching this interplanetary backbone growing over time. So that's where we are. I'll stop there and I'll stop sharing here if I can figure out how to do that. And we'll try to answer some questions.
All right, Dr. Cerf, thank you so much. That is just amazing, amazing things that you're working on. And thank you for sharing that with us. I do have a couple of people with questions. We have Anne, a student in the course, as well as Michael. So if you would like to go ahead, Anne.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I
Yep.
can.
Okay, thank you. How interesting. Now I have a million questions for you, but the question that I had offered was, with your experience in this and all of us just starting new, what kind of counsel or guidance do you have for us in the internet future?
Well, the first thing is to recognize that the environment of the internet is not what it was when we first started. We were a bunch of engineers trying to get this thing to work. Everybody had the same objective. Nobody had any intent to blow the thing up or destroy it or interfere with it or anything else. Even though it was a Defense Department project, our focus of attention was on getting it to work. Since that time, especially now that it's become a commercial entity, we have all kinds of people who do not have your best interest at heart. And so reinforcing the network, making it more resilient, reliable, defending against a variety of different potential attacks is important. We knew that we needed to pay attention to that because this was intended to be the basis for the DoD's command and control system. But I postponed the introduction of a lot of the cryptography in the system at the beginning because I knew that it would interfere with our ability to just test the basic system and get it to work. But today, you really have to be aware of the risk factors that you can encounter in an online environment, and you need lots of tools to defend yourself. So end-to-end crypto and two-factor authentication, updates of your software to keep up with bug fixes, all those things are really important. And you have to use critical thinking when you're dealing with online applications to make sure that you're not inadvertently fooled into thinking something's true that is not, which means some serious exercise of the wetware up here.
Kind of back to your critical thinking mode, but it's sad that we are spending so much R&D on the security. That level of creativity, we could move forward with the functionality. So great, but it's necessary.
Well, and some people say, why didn't you put all the crypto and other protections in right at the beginning? And I worried that the graduate students who were doing all the work would be unreliable custodians of crypto keys and things like that, because you get distracted by final exams and papers and so on. So I knew that was retrofittable, so I didn't force it in. Also, when public key crypto was announced, it was 1976. And I was running the program at ARPA at that point, and there were no protocols, and there were no algorithms available until RSA shows up. And by the time that's available, it's around 78. And at that point, I'm trying to freeze the protocols and get everything implemented on the operating systems to show that we can do expansion. Nonetheless, we need to implement all of those things, and we would want that not only for the Defense Department, which has several different networks, as some of you might know. Some are secret level, some are on class, and some are even higher level, top secret and up. They introduce a variety of different cryptographic methods in order to protect our sensitive information.
Thank you so much. And Michael, would you like to ask yours?
I'll do my best here. I didn't know of the relationship with, I don't know if you have a relationship with the ARIA community then for providing, assistive technologies. Is that something I heard at the beginning of the talk?
It depends on, well, I am involved considerably with the Disability Alliance at Google, the deaf groups, because I'm hearing impaired. So I'm also involved with the Greglers, folks with a little gray hair, and who also experience a variety of problems, either vision or hearing or motor problems. So the answer is I am involved in accessibility and very interested in finding ways of improving the accessibility of all of the applications on the net.
Okay. Well, thank you. Yeah, I hadn't heard about that. My question is, are there alternatives we're working on or any likelihood of moving beyond an advertising model for the supporting the internet?
Yes, absolutely. And what we're starting to see is that there are other services that are being offered on a subscription basis, whether it's access to cloud computing in order to implement services to other people, or to run your own programs because you're trying to use those to do research or to build a product or something. Then so the subscription model is showing up. It's even showing up in the entertainment space. So YouTube has subscription models, Google TV has a subscription model, Apple TV and Netflix and so on. So subscriptions may be another avenue to supplement or replace advertising as a way of supporting all of this and still providing services to everybody. It's been very attractive to offer services for free, and for a lot of people, that's the right price. But the price you pay is, advertising. But I think we at Google recognize that we should have multiple ways in which people can get access to these products, services, and information.
Thank you.
All right. So Rosie here made a comment, just that she thought your internet map looked like a neural network with synapses firing. Just wanted to share that with you from Rosie. I have a question for you. Is chocolate ice cream your favorite flavor?
Actually, no, my favorite flavor is coffee. I'm a huge fan
Okay.
of Haagen-Dazs coffee ice cream.
Okay, well, next time I meet you, I'll give you a pint. But to to a real question, Dr. Cerf, I know you get called up to the Capitol Hill to, talk about the work that you're doing. Would you mind sharing with us some of the things that you are participating in or are deliberating?
Well, certainly there are all kinds of questions associated with safety and security in the online environment. The country and the legislators are worried, not just in the U.S., but in other countries around the world, that people are not as safe as they should be in the online environment. So the question is what to do about that. Accountability is very important, and I mentioned that in my earlier remarks. And so is agency, in the sense of having the ability to defend yourself, or a company defend you on your behalf. So we need technology and rules and regulatory frameworks in which accountability is feasible. And we have lots of discussions about that on the Hill. I think there's also, as you know, a considerable challenge, a competitive challenge with China today. Less a different challenge with the Russians, but it's not so much technical as it is military. But the challenge with China is essentially the pursuit of very high-tech capabilities. And there's a great deal of interest in assuring that our own internal supply chains and our capacity to make use of high-tech capabilities is unchallenged. And therefore, there's a lot of interest in investing not only in infrastructure. As you all know, the $42 billion coming from NTIA and broadband is a huge, major change. But even, for example, the National Science Foundation has created a new directorate that's focused on technology transfer. The National Institutes of Standards and Technology have an advanced manufacturing capability, which is also being increased support for, which is increasing. And so there's a lot going on there to assure that the country can take advantage of all of these technologies in order to maintain its high standard of living and its competitive stance in a continually evolving world.
Wow. So I have so many more questions, and I know that a lot of the students here at DU, which is very known for its international relations program, I bet they would have so many more questions for you. But I do have one from Rolf here in the chat. He asks, what mistakes did you make in the development of the internet that you wished you or others had done differently?
Well, one of them, of course, is the original design of the system. And it used a 32-bit address space, which at the time was big enough for 4.3 billion terminations, which in 1973 was more than there were people on the planet. And so Bob Kahn and I thought, well, that ought to be enough to do an experiment. And I genuinely believed, as the program manager, that if this worked, if we demonstrated it, that we would then do a production version of it. Well, the experiment escaped into the public use in 1989 with the first commercial internet services. And only 3 years later did we realize that we really needed a larger address space. And so the Internet Engineering Task Force deliberated for almost 4 years until they came to IP version 6 in 1996 with 128-bit address space, which is 3.4 times 10 to the 38th addresses. We estimate that about 35% of all the networks on the planet are capable of running V4 and V6. We'd like it to be 100%. It's been a long, slow slog, but the IoT increase and the increase in the number of mobiles is driving towards the V6 address space because we need all those addresses for all the devices that are showing up. So I'm hoping that this decade will see the completion of IPv6 deployment. The other people have said, why didn't you put more crypto in at the very beginning? And I addressed that before. The answer is I knew we could retrofit most of that. And so I delayed that deliberately. Today, of course, we need to put crypto in a lot of different places, including in the core of the network, where the BGP protocol needs to be reinforced to avoid the kinds of misrouting that can show up. But there's still plenty of work to be done.
So, Dr. Cerf, I realize your time is precious, and we are so grateful for your generosity in sharing it. We are at time, but do you have a few minutes for more questions, or do you need to go?
I actually have a few minutes, and I see that there's a question here about Web3. That's a marketing term. I'm not sure anybody really knows what it is. I think if you asked Tim Berners-Lee, he'd say that he doesn't know what it is either, and he never argued in favor of it. But some people think, well, that must mean virtual reality or metaverse or some, three-dimensional space that you get to by wearing a headset. And that is an interesting environment. We've experienced it before in a weak form called Second Life, where you had an avatar and it flew around in different places. And there are other examples of that where, games where people were building in a three-dimensional environment, constructing places that other people could visit. And so I'm pretty sure that virtual reality will be an important part of the internet environment. Certainly the entertainment industry sees that a big opportunity there. But it may also turn out that we can consume information, discover information, and interact with information in richer ways in this three-dimensional environment. I still think that wearing this thing on your face for any lengthy period of time will be kind of tiring. And so I have to admit, I'm not a huge fan of imagining spending 8 hours a day with the thing on your head. To make matters worse, if we were doing this kind of interaction and you had a camera in front of you, but you're wearing this headset, everybody would look like Darth Vader. And so now you want to have an avatar, and then you don't know, whether the avatar is representative of the real person or whether, I have hair in my avatar that I don't really have. So, with a real Vint Cerf, please stand up. So I think we have a long ways to go to figure out what this evolution of the World Wide Web looks like. I do think augmented reality may turn out to be the more important avenue here, where we have information about the real world that we can present to you because you're wearing glasses that have a display in them, which is what we did at Google some time ago called Google Glass, which is our first experiment in that kind of augmented reality. So I'm pretty sure that will turn out to have considerable application over time. Lots more to happen. People say, are we done? And the answer is no. Probably 1% of all the possible applications have been built. And larger and larger number of them become more feasible as we have higher capacity and lower latency. and more computing power in order to support the kind of online environment that we're exploring.
All right. And are you up for a question about China?
Well, this says, yes, it says they'd like to hear a little more about what we think about China. Does
Yes,
Jeff
go
want
ahead,
to
Jeff.
answer a specific question?
I'll just give, yeah, big topic. We talk about it a lot with DU. I'm sure you think about it a lot. Everything from, taking a very global macroeconomic point of view. You talked about some of the work we're doing to protect our intellectual property, et cetera, and ensure that America is at the forefront. But more broadly, we have a rise of a very, an ascendant power that wants to control the internet and use it for the state's advantage, not for the, for the individual's advantage. It's such a broad topic, it's hard to ask a question, but how do you and Google approach with all those ideas now in innocence?
Jeff, you're really breaking up badly for me. I don't know if anybody else is having that problem, but I think I get the drift of your comment. As a scientist, I believe that collaboration and cooperation in the pursuit of science is really important. And I wish that we could pursue that goal. Even during the Cold War, we had collaborative interactions with the Russians, for example. The International Institute of Applied Systems Analysis in Europe was a central place where East-West interactions occurred. At the moment, that's proving to be difficult because there is a very clear competitive voice coming out of President Xi in China, essentially drawing a line in the sand and saying, we will compete. And so we have responses to that. In the long run, I hope that we discover it's possible to still have a collaborative and cooperative environment where we all benefit from each other's work, and that the openness of scientific research is maintained. But I will say that today we're seeing that openness impaired by a competition which is being very deliberately driven in many respects by China.
Dr. Cerf, thank you so very much. I think unless you want to stick around, I am prepared to close it out.
Well, I'm just looking back at the chat just to see whether I missed anything else here. I see that emailing Captain Kirk. Actually, I have emailed the guy that plays Captain Kirk. That's been a fun thing. And I see Dave Taylor mentions the reconstitution protocol. My recollection of that is that it didn't work right. And Steve Crocker and I were trying to do that sort of thing way back in the earliest days before TCP/IP. And we got all tangled up in trying to be perhaps too elaborate for the problem at hand. I have found simplicity to be your friend in a lot of these environments, particularly the simplicity of the internet protocol has been very important. It doesn't know, the packets don't know how they're being carried, and they don't know what they're carrying. And you would think that would be a deficit. It turns out to be a tremendous benefit, because when we add new communication protocols, the packets just flow and they don't care how they're being carried. And since they don't know what they're carrying, if you want to add a new application, the network doesn't change because the packet switching system doesn't know what the applications are. So that's turned out, this apparent ignorance has turned out to be a benefit. Well, we should wrap up because I have another call to take. In fact, I have people coming to do a video shoot. But thanks for letting me take up some of your time. I enjoyed my talk anyway. I hope you did. And I look forward to another encounter. Meanwhile,
Yes.
as they say, see you on the net.
Thank you, Dr. Cerf.
Bye-bye, everybody.
All right. So closing comments for everybody here. Thank you for joining us today. Thanks to my students for joining and those fabulous questions. I'm going to accept any questions that you would like to follow up with. Please email me at amanda.coleman@du.edu. Happy Veterans Day, and have a great weekend, everybody.
Thank you, Dr. Coleman. This was great.
Thank you, Anne. Hi there, Kathy.